This is the $20 billion World Cup gamble nobody is talking about. When FIFA awarded the 2026 World Cup to the United States, Canada, and Mexico, the reaction was exactly what you would expect. Politicians celebrated, business leaders praised the decision. Tourism officials started talking about millions of visitors, and economists began publishing projections worth billions of dollars. The headlines practically wrote themselves. The biggest World Cup in history, 48 teams, 104 matches, 16 host cities, millions of fans traveling across North America. And according to various economic projections, tens of billions of dollars in economic activity. For many people, it sounded like a guaranteed success. After all, if millions of football fans travel to a country, stay in hotels, eat in restaurants, attend matches, and spend money wherever they go, surely the economy benefits, right? Well, maybe. Because beneath all the excitement lies a question that surprisingly few people are asking. If the World Cup is expected to generate billions of dollars, who actually gets that money? And perhaps more importantly, who's taking the risk if those expectations turn out to be wrong? Because despite the headlines, the 2026 World Cup isn't just a football tournament. It's a massive economic gamble, a gamble involving governments, businesses, investors, host cities, and perhaps most importantly, FIFA itself. And as we'll discover, the biggest winner may not be who most people expect. To understand why, we first need to understand the promise. The economic case for hosting a World Cup sounds incredibly compelling. Millions of visitors arrive from around the world. Hotels experience record demand. Airlines add routes and increase ticket prices. Restaurants become packed. Local businesses see a surge in customers. Tax revenues increase. Jobs are created. Money flows into the economy. At least that's the theory. And to be fair, there is truth to it. The World Cup absolutely generates economic activity. There is no serious debate about that. The debate begins when people start talking about how much economic value is actually being created. Because economic activity and economic benefit are not always the same thing. And that's where things start getting complicated. Imagine a football fan from Germany who has always wanted to visit New York City. He's been planning the trip for years. Then the World Cup gets announced. Instead of visiting in October, he decides to visit during the tournament. He spends $5,000 during his trip. He stays in hotels. He eats in restaurants. He uses local transportation. He attends matches. From the outside, it looks like the World Cup generated $5,000 for the local economy. But did it really? Not necessarily, because that same visitor may have spent that money in New York anyway. The spending didn't appear out of nowhere. It simply happened at a different time. Economists have a name for this. It's called the substitution effect. And while it may sound technical, the idea is actually quite simple. If spending would have happened anyway, can it really be counted as a new economic benefit? That's one of the biggest criticisms economists make when evaluating major sporting events. The headline numbers often sound enormous, but when researchers take a closer look, they sometimes discover that part of the economic activity was simply shifted rather than created. And that's just the beginning, because there's another issue that receives far less attention. Imagine you're planning a family vacation. You want to visit Miami, or Los Angeles, or New York. Then you realize the World Cup is happening during the exact same period. Hotel prices have increased, flights are more expensive, tourist attractions are crowded, traffic is worse. Suddenly, the destination becomes less attractive. So instead of visiting one of those cities, you decide to go somewhere else. This phenomenon is known as crowding out, and economists have observed it repeatedly during major sporting events. While World Cup visitors arrive, some regular tourists decide to stay away, which means that not every visitor creates additional economic activity. Sometimes one visitor simply replaces another. Again, the economy may benefit, but perhaps not as much as the headlines suggest. This is why economists often approach economic impact studies with caution. Many studies do an excellent job estimating spending that comes into a region, but measuring spending that disappears is much more difficult. And that's where projections can become controversial. Now, before we go any further, it's important to clarify something. None of this means the World Cup is a bad investment, and it certainly doesn't mean businesses won't benefit. In fact, many businesses are likely to have an exceptional year. Hotels could experience some of the highest occupancy rates they've seen in years. Airlines may benefit from increased international travel. Restaurants, bars, and entertainment venues could see significant increases in revenue. For many companies, the tournament may represent one of the most profitable periods of the decade. The real question isn't whether there will be winners. There absolutely will be. The question is who wins the most. And that's where FIFA enters the story. Because whenever people discuss the economics of the World Cup, they tend to focus on host cities: Dallas, Miami, Atlanta, Los Angeles, Seattle, New York. But very few people stop and ask a simple question. Who actually owns the tournament? The answer is FIFA. And once you understand FIFA's business model, the economics of the World Cup begin to look very different. Most people assume ticket sales are where the big money is made. In reality, tickets are only part of the picture. The largest revenue streams come from broadcasting rights, sponsorship agreements, commercial partnerships, hospitality packages, licensing deals, and merchandise. These revenue streams generate billions of dollars, and much of that money flows directly to FIFA. That's not a criticism. It's simply the structure of the tournament. FIFA owns the event, FIFA controls the commercial rights, and FIFA earns revenue from those rights. In fact, one reason the 2026 World Cup is so significant is because it is expected to generate record revenues for FIFA. More teams means more matches mean more broadcasting opportunities. More broadcasting opportunities mean more advertising revenue, more fans mean more sponsorship value, and more sponsorship value means more money. It's a remarkably effective business model, which creates an interesting dynamic. Host cities provide the infrastructure. They coordinate transportation, they increase security, they prepare public services, they manage logistics. Meanwhile, FIFA controls many of the tournament's most valuable revenue streams. And that's where the gamble begins. Because while billions of dollars are expected to flow through the economy, not all of those billions stay where the matches are played. Some flow to sponsors, some flow to broadcasters, some flow to global corporations, and a substantial portion flows directly back to FIFA. So when people talk about the economic benefits of hosting the World Cup, the obvious question becomes this: who is actually receiving the largest share of the rewards? The answer is much more complicated than many people realize. Now, supporters of the tournament would argue that this perspective misses something important. And to be fair, they have a point. Not every benefit can be measured directly. Some benefits are intangible. For example, global exposure. The World Cup attracts billions of viewers from around the world. Cities like Dallas, Miami, and Atlanta will receive enormous international attention. Tourism officials hope that some viewers will eventually become future visitors. Business leaders hope that increased visibility will attract investment. Local governments hope that the event will strengthen their international reputation. These benefits are real. The challenge is measuring them. How do you calculate the value of someone deciding to visit Miami 3 years from now because they watched a World Cup match there? How do you estimate future business opportunities created by international exposure? The truth is that nobody knows with certainty. And that's one reason debates about the economics of sporting events never seem to end. Some analysts emphasize measurable costs. Others focus on potential long-term benefits. Both sides have valid arguments, but there's another reason why the 2026 World Cup is different from many tournaments that came before it. Unlike previous hosts, the United States doesn't need to build an entire tournament from scratch. Think about countries like Brazil, South Africa, or Qatar. Each of those nations invested enormous sums in infrastructure projects connected to the tournament. New stadiums, new transportation systems, new facilities. Some of those investments proved useful. Others became famous examples of what economists call white elephants, large projects that generated very little long-term value after the event ended. The United States enters the tournament in a much stronger position. Most of the stadiums already exist. Most of the airports already exist. Most of the hotels already exist. Most of the transportation infrastructure already exists. That's a major advantage because it significantly reduces financial risk. Instead of spending tens of billions constructing entirely new facilities, the United States can focus on improving assets that are already in place. And that alone makes the economic case for hosting the tournament much stronger. But even then, another challenge remains: scale. The American economy is enormous. We're talking about an economy worth nearly $30 trillion. That number is so large, it's difficult to comprehend. And because the economy is so large, even a major event like the World Cup can appear surprisingly small when viewed at the national level. Think of it this way. If you pour a bucket of water into the ocean, the amount of water absolutely increases. But the ocean barely notices. That's often how economists view mega sporting events. The benefits may be meaningful for specific industries, specific companies, specific regions, but the national economy as a whole may barely register the impact. This doesn't mean the benefits aren't real. It simply means they may not be transformational. And that's an important distinction, because many of the headlines surrounding the World Cup create the impression that the tournament will fundamentally change the economy. History suggests that's unlikely. When researchers study previous World Cups and Olympic Games, they often find that the long-term economic impact is smaller than initial projections suggested. Not because the events fail, not because nobody makes money, but because expectations are often unrealistic. The reality is usually more nuanced. Some businesses win big, others barely notice a difference. Some cities benefit significantly, others struggle to justify the costs. And that's why economists remain cautious. They're not saying the World Cup won't create value. They're questioning how much value will ultimately remain after the tournament ends. Then there's another factor that could influence everything: timing. The World Cup doesn't exist in a vacuum. Its economic success depends heavily on broader economic conditions. If consumer confidence remains strong, spending could exceed expectations. If international travel remains healthy, tourism numbers could surge. If businesses continue investing, economic benefits may spread further throughout the economy. But if growth slows, if consumers become more cautious, if travel demand weakens, then even the biggest sporting event in history may struggle to achieve the results people expect. In other words, the success of the World Cup depends on much more than football. It depends on the economy surrounding football. And that's something nobody can fully predict. So where does all of this leave us? Will the 2026 World Cup generate billions of dollars? Almost certainly. Will businesses benefit? Without question. Will millions of visitors create enormous economic activity? Absolutely. But those aren't the questions that make this story interesting. The interesting questions are much harder to answer. Who benefits the most? How much of the spending is genuinely new? How much stays in local communities? How much flows to FIFA and its commercial partners? And how much of the projected economic impact will still matter 5 years after the final match? Those are the questions economists continue debating. And those are the questions that make the World Cup such a fascinating financial story. Because in the end, the $20 billion gamble isn't really about football. It's about expectations. It's about risk. It's about investment. And it's about whether the people making those investments ultimately receive the returns they're hoping for. When the tournament begins, the world will focus on the action on the pitch, the goals, the celebrations, the drama, the trophies. But behind the scenes, another competition will be taking place. A competition measured not in goals, but in dollars. A competition involving governments, businesses, investors, sponsors, and FIFA itself. And unlike the football tournament, we won't know the winner when the final whistle blows. The true economic impact of the 2026 World Cup may take years to understand. But one thing is already clear. The biggest gamble of the tournament isn't happening on the field. It's happening in boardrooms, city halls, corporate offices, and economic forecasts across North America. And that's the $20 billion gamble almost nobody is talking about.